Tutorial, we're going to talk about how we can now get this data through its entire persistence from the watch, the cell phone, and then finally up into our cloud database. So in the previous videos, we talked about how we can kind of select our flow and how this modifies, for example, the screens. Select two of them, and then we can kind of say how we're feeling. And if you look up here, we have our object that gets sent to the cloud, and I'm just going to talk about how this kind of continues this compilation and how it gets sent out. So the last thing we talked about was, oh wait, I'm in the companion. Let's go back to the app. So the show thank you. So show thank you is the final function that gets called, and then at the end it executes send feedback of ready. So if we go to that, where it says compile data and send to companion. Now we talked before about how we actually send the data to companion, but one thing I haven't mentioned is that there is also some geolocation done. So it also tries to capture where the person is. Now if the watch is an ionic, it has GPS integrated into the Fitbit itself. So it will then try for 20 seconds to determine the person's location. If that fails, it kind of goes through a location error and it just says, well, we don't have a latitude or longitude data, send that to null, and then send the data to companion. But if it is successful, then we determine the coordinates and send it to companion. Now, on the verses, they don't actually have GPS, so it uses the GPS of the cell phone. And if the user, for example, has location services off or doesn't allow Fitbit to access the location services, or if it's on power saving mode, this will not work. So it's just something to keep in mind, and will always fail. So it's important that you allow it to fail, and don't just rely on success. There's also this concept called maximum age, and this basically means that if a successful GPS point was recorded 1 minute ago, it will just take that as the GPS position, so it doesn't even then need to execute the entire geolocation script. So once this is done, it then sends data to companion, which we talked about in a previous video. And let's go to our companion JavaScript file. So we've read the data from the watch. It's all relatively straightforward. And we finally send the data to Influx. Great. There is an API key that I've constructed already. And this is just a very simple fetch URL. Now, before I send it, of course, there is the user ID and the experimental ID, which I've currently just set as debug, which is my general debugging words. So I need to get that information, so I do that through setting storage get item user ID and get item experimental ID. If we go back to our settings index.jsx file, you can see here I've created a section with the settings key user ID and a settings key experimental ID, and that is where the user can input this information. So once I pull that information and put it into a JSON file, I can then just send it through a very simple fetch query. Now once it's done, I can also see if that was successful, and if you go to the cozie website, there's information about how you can query your data. So this is basically the API key that allows us to pull the information. So if we go here, normally I would do this programmatically, but just to show so I can go experiment ID equals debug, and already just pushing enter here should get me my information. Now if I just send the experimental ID, it gives me a JSON file of all users that have the experimental ID. I can also then be more specific and get, there we go, it comes automatically, and user ID equals debug, and this now just gets a particular experimental ID and a particular user. I can then also request how many weeks of data I want. So if I go weeks equals 1, this is I think it's just from today, or like doing all these tutorials. But if we go, let's say 10 weeks of data, then yeah, So this is debugging that has been happening over the last 10 weeks, more or less, is me playing with the emulator. So the one funny thing you might notice is all these kind of backslashes, what that's all about. Now, the reason is that cozie has been primarily designed to be run with Python and with pandas, particularly in mind. So cozie works very well. You can take in this kind of JSON file and do a pandas read JSON, I think. And import it directly into a pandas data frame. And in fact, there is a example. If we go cozie examples, I have another repository here with just example scripts. So here we import pandas, set up a payload, run that same, this is the exact same URL that I just put in my browser earlier, and yeah, just simply read this JSON file and you have a really nicely prearranged cozie data frame. Now, while this is all nice and good, it is a little bit problematic if I am trying to use cozie data with JavaScript, for example. It's a little bit of a pain. So if anyone would like to help me create kind of potentially like maybe we could have like a separate API key potentially for more JavaScript friendly JSON files. This is something I'm more than willing to accept. And yeah, that is more or less it. So if you're kind of using cozie as a template, you can then of course set your own URL here, right? And create your own. I'm using an Amazon AWS API gateway, which then runs to a Lambda function. And then I have another gateway on the other side, which then allows me to call the data quite simply. Yeah, I think that's it for now until maybe just a tiny thing. These are just some random utility functions. But yeah, cool. That's all for now. And if more ideas come to mind, then I'll make another screencast related to that. Cool. Good luck.